The man I was about to marry smelled of another she-wolf, my best friend. It was a perfume of betrayal clinging to him at the altar, a scent so sharp I was sure the whole pack could smell our lie. But the only one who seemed to notice was the visiting Alpha King, whose cold eyes promised an entirely different kind of ruin. Chapter 1. A Whisper of Moonflower. The rhythmic scrape and crush of the stone pestle was the only sound in the small hut. Thump, shh, thump, shh. Celine kept her head down. Her world narrowed to the smooth, cool bowl of the mortar. In it, dried lavender and silver root became a fine, fragrant powder, the scent a dusty purple cloud that clung to her clothes and hair. Her movements were small, precise, almost apologetic, as if she were sorry for taking up space in the world. It was a feeling she knew well, a feeling that lived in her bones. Beside her mortar, her mother's journal lay open. The leather was worn as soft as a doe's ear, the pages filled with elegant script she could read, and glowing silver symbols she could not. They pulsed with a faint inner light, like captured starlight, shifting when she wasn't looking directly at them. They were a lock without a key, a whispered secret just beyond her hearing. Her mother had been a healer too, but the journal spoke of a different kind of magic, a wilder sort. "Your hands are a gift, child." The voice made Celine jump, her shoulders hunching toward her ears. Martha, the pack's elder healer, stood over her, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes kind but tired. She pointed a gnarled finger at the perfect consistency of the powder. "You have your mother's touch, a born healer." She paused, her gaze flicking to the journal, and the kindness in her eyes tightened into something else, something like fear. "But you also have her blood. Remember what I told you, Celine. Stay quiet, stay small. A field mouse is safe because the wolf never sees it." A field mouse. Was that all she was meant to be? Her fingers tightened on the pestle, a flicker of something hot and defiant warming her chest before it died out. Martha was only trying to protect her, because a life of being quiet and small was better than the alternative. Her mother's fate was a story told in hushed tones around campfires. A tragedy, a curse, a warning. A young pack member burst through the door flap, his chest heaving. "Celine! Alpha Kale summons you. The feast, for the royal guest. It's starting." The pestle stilled. The feast. Her pre-ceremony feast. Tomorrow, at the full moon, she would stand at the altar with Kale. She would finally have a place, a purpose. She would belong. It was the one hope she clung to, the one dream that made being a field mouse bearable. Why then did the summons feel less like a promise and more like a verdict? She wiped her dusty hands on her simple tunic, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She could feel the weight of Martha's stare on her back, a silent, worried prayer. With one last, lingering touch to the cover of her mother's journal, Celine straightened her spine. It was a small act of courage, but it was hers. Stepping out of the herb-scented dimness of the hut and into the long shadows of the evening, she felt a strange shift in the air, a change in pressure. Something was coming, something that would make being small and quiet utterly impossible. Chapter 2. The King in the Shadows. The Great Hall was a beast made of noise and heat. 100 conversations roared at once, a tidal wave of sound that crashed over Celine the moment she entered. The air, thick with the smell of roasted boar, pine torches, and sweating bodies, was a world away from the calm, clean scent of her herbs. She felt her carefully constructed composure begin to fray, the desire to shrink back into the shadows so strong it was a physical pull. Everyone was laughing, celebrating her, yet she had never felt more alone. Her fiancé, Kyle, stood near the head table, a golden cup in his hand. He was the future alpha of their pack, handsome, confident, and adored. He was everything she wasn't, and right now he was leaning in close to Ilara, his hand resting on the small of her back. Ilara, her best friend, whose laughter was a little too loud, whose smile was a little too bright as she looked up at him. The scent of her friend's moonflower perfume seemed to reach Celine even from across the room, a sweet, cloying poison. Kale finally saw her, and his smile didn't so much as falter. It simply shifted, the warmth vanishing, replaced by an indulgent condescension. "Celine, there you are. Go find a seat." He waved a dismissive hand toward the lower tables, before turning right back to Alara. The casual cruelty was a familiar sting. He had never seen her. Not really. She was an obligation, a duty, an Omega healer he was required to bind with to secure his pack's alliances. The hope she'd carried with her from the hut withered and died, leaving a cold, hollow ache in its place. She was a fool to think a title would change the man. As she turned away, a strange electric current shot up her spine, raising the hairs on her arms. It was a feeling of being watched, hunted. Her eyes scanned the room, past the dancing, past the feasting, and found him. He was in the corner, half hidden by shadow, a brooding, terrifying presence that seemed to suck all the light and sound from his part of the hall. The royal guest, Alpha King Darius Blackthorn. Stories about him were whispered like ghost tales, a ruthless king whose wolf was a broken, unstable monster ever since his first mate was killed. They said he was more beast than man, that he ruled with an iron fist because his heart was a frozen stone. He was bigger than any wolf she had ever seen, his power a palpable force that pressed on the air. His eyes, they were the color of a winter storm, cold and piercing. And they were locked on her. The world tilted. The roar of the hall faded to a dull hum. It was more than a look. It was a physical shock, a jolt that went straight to her soul, a primal, terrifying recognition that made no sense. He was a stranger, a monster. So why did a deep, forgotten part of her stir in response? Why did her wolf, usually so dormant and quiet, suddenly feel like it was clawing at the inside of her skin, desperate to answer a call she couldn't hear? She tried to tear her gaze away, to shrink and become the field mouse Martha wanted her to be. But she couldn't. His stare held her fast, a magnetic pull that was equal parts terror and something else. Something that felt dangerously like coming home. The feast carried on around them, a blur of motion and noise. But in the silent, charged space between the helpless Omega and the ruthless King, a new story had just begun. And Celine had the terrible feeling it was one she would not survive. Chapter 3. An Altar of Ash. Hope is a fragile, foolish thing. Celine felt it bloom in her chest one last time as she stood at the entrance to the ceremonial clearing. The ceremonial gown, woven with moonflower silks, was light on her shoulders, but the weight of the pack's expectation was a physical burden. This was it, the moment that would define her life. She would be mated. She would belong. The hollow ache from the feast last night was pushed down, ignored, replaced by a desperate, shimmering prayer. She walked the path to the altar, a lone figure in white. The entire pack was gathered, their faces a sea of anticipation. Her eyes found Alara in the crowd, who gave her a tight, unreadable smile. She saw Martha, wringing her hands, her expression grim, and then she saw Kale, waiting for her at the altar, his face handsome and smug. He smelled clean today. The cloying scent of moonflower was gone, replaced by the sharp, mocking scent of his own satisfaction, and in the front row, a place of honor, sat King Darius. He was a statue carved from shadow and fury, his expression unreadable stone. But his silver eyes were fixed on her, and the intensity of his gaze was the only thing that felt real in this entire glittering lie. She reached the altar, her hands trembling. The elder began the rite, his voice a low drone, speaking of loyalty, of pack, of the sacred bond blessed by the moon goddess herself. Celine kept her eyes on the ground, focusing on the ritual, on the words that were supposed to be her salvation. And now, do you, Kyle of the Silver Moon Pack, take this Omega as your mate, to cherish and protect, to bind your soul to hers for all eternity? The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched on, and on, a sharp, cold thing. Celine finally dared to look up. Kyle was smirking, a cruel, triumphant curve of his lips. He let the silence hang for another heartbeat, savoring it before he spoke, his voice ringing out for all to hear. No. A collective gasp rippled through the pack. The elder's eyes went wide. Celine's blood ran cold. Kale took a step back from her, as if she were something unclean. I, Kale of the Silver Moon Pack, reject you, Celine Rivers. The words were a physical blow. A searing, white-hot agony tore through her chest as the fledgling bond between them shattered. It was a pain beyond anything she had ever known, a raw, gaping wound ripped into her very soul. She staggered, a cry catching in her throat. But he wasn't finished. How could I ever bind myself to a useless, weak Omega? He sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. One who carries the tainted blood of her mother? The pack deserves a strong Luna, not the last dregs of a cursed bloodline. He turned to the crowd, his arms sweeping out. I choose my own mate. I choose Alara. Alara stepped forward from the crowd, a victorious smirk on her face as she moved to Kale's side, taking his hand. The betrayal was absolute, complete. The pain in Celine's soul doubled, a howling vortex of agony. She collapsed to her knees, the world dissolving into a blur of gray. Humiliated, broken, discarded. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, pitying, scornful, curious. But the only ones she saw in her mind were the cold, silver eyes of the king. Had he known? Had this been a show for his benefit? The thought was a final twist of the knife. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she pushed herself to her feet. And she ran. She fled the altar of her humiliation, ignoring the shouts and the whispers. She ran from the clearing, a wounded animal seeking cover, stumbling blindly toward the deep, silent embrace of the moonlit forest. The pain was a living thing inside her clawing its way out, and she knew with a chilling certainty it was going to kill her. Chapter 4. A King's Ruin, a Wolf's Demand. The spectacle was pathetic. From his seat of honor, Darius Blackthorne watched the sniveling Alpha reject the little Omega and felt nothing but contempt. Politics in these minor packs was so tedious, a public mating ceremony twisted into a display of petty dominance. The girl, Celine, was a trembling, worthless thing, just as the boy Kale had claimed. Her scent was faint, muddled by the cloying moonflowers of the ceremony, and her power was a barely there flicker. Insignificant. He had wasted his time attending. He was ready to leave, to return to the cold silence of his own castle, because the beast inside him was beginning to stir, and it hated crowds. He was rising to depart when it happened. As the girl's soul was torn apart by the rejection, a different scent bloomed in the air. Not the weak, herbal smell of a healer, but something primal, something impossible. It was the fragrance of moonflower crushed under a silver moon, of ancient forests and hidden magic. It was a scent his soul knew, a scent his wolf had been howling for in its sleep for years. It slammed into him not like a perfume, but like a physical blow, a lightning strike to his very core. Mate. The word was not a thought. It was a brand of fire on his soul, a roar that obliterated every other sense. The beast inside him, the broken, raging thing he kept chained in the dungeons of his mind, shattered its fetters. It surged forward, a tidal wave of pure, possessive fury, and the king drowned. All that was left was the wolf, mine. He was on his feet, a growl ripping from his throat so savage that nearby pack members scrambled away in terror. The world was red. All he could see, all he could smell, all he could feel was her. The little Omega, his mate. And she was running. She was hurt. The scent of her pain was a knife twisting in his gut, a torment far worse than the rejection she had suffered. He didn't remember moving. The great hall, the stunned pack, the fuming little Alpha, they ceased to exist. He was a shadow, a blur of motion, propelled by a singular, violent need. To find her, to claim her, to soothe the agony that was echoing from her soul into his. He found her at the base of an ancient oak, curled into a small, broken ball on the damp earth. The scent of her agony was thick, a miasma of death and despair. She was fading. The rejection from a false mate was one thing, but for a wolf of her suppressed lineage, it was a fatal blow. He could feel her life slipping away because their newly awakened bond was screaming it at him. The wolf demanded he claim her. A full mating mark, right here, right now, to overwrite the poison of the rejection and bind her to him forever. But the sliver of the king that remained knew it would be too much. She was too weak. A full claim would shatter her fragile mind. Save her. Save U.S. A desperate, primal act was the only way. He knelt, his shadow falling over her trembling form. His fangs descended, long and sharp. He didn't bite to claim. He bit to anchor. He sank his teeth into the soft flesh where her neck met her shoulder, a half mark. An incomplete, ragged brand that poured just enough of his life force, his power, his very essence into her to stop the bleeding of her soul. A wave of agonizing relief crashed through him, so potent it stole his breath. The beast inside him stilled, purring for the first time in an eternity. The screaming in his own soul went quiet. He pulled back, a string of saliva and blood connecting them for a moment. She was unconscious, her face slack with a strange, new peace. He had saved her. He had saved himself. And as he gathered the small, fragile Omega into his arms, the cold, logical king resurfaced, horrified. He had just bound himself to a weak, rejected girl from a backwater pack. He had just found his fated mate, his cure. And she was a problem that could ruin his entire kingdom. Chapter 5. A Cage of Silk and Shadow. The first thing she noticed was the silence, not the quiet of the forest, which was always alive with the whisper of leaves and the breath of small creatures. This was a deep, heavy silence that soaked up all sound. The second thing she noticed was the absence of pain. The howling vortex in her soul was gone, replaced by a strange, humming warmth centered on her neck. Celine's eyes fluttered open. She was not on the cold, damp forest floor. She was in a bed so vast it felt like a field of snow, under sheets that felt like spun silk against her skin. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth across the room, its golden light dancing over towering shelves of books, over dark carved wood, over tapestries depicting ancient, brutal battles. The air smelled of old paper, wood smoke, and something else. Something wild and clean, like a storm just before it breaks. Ozone. Power. Him. She sat up, the silk sheet pooling around her waist. Her simple healer's tunic was gone, replaced by a soft linen nightgown. On her neck, where her fingers ghosted over, the skin was raised and tender. A mark. But not a full mating mark. It was something else. Something unfinished. The heavy wooden door opened without a sound, and he was there. King Darius Blackthorn filled the doorway, a living mountain of shadow and muscle. He was even more terrifying up close, his presence so immense it seemed to steal the air from her lungs. He moved with a predator's silent grace, his storm-colored eyes pinning her to the bed. He wasn't looking at her with concern or kindness, or even anger. He was looking at her the way a blacksmith looks at a piece of iron he is about to bend to his will. "You're awake," he stated. It was not a question. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floor. Celine pulled the sheet tighter. "Where am I? What did you do to me?" "You are in my castle, and I saved your life." He walked to a table and poured a glass of water, his movements economical and precise. He didn't offer it to her. "The rejection was killing you. Your bloodline makes you susceptible. I stopped it." "How?" she whispered, though she already knew. She could feel the answer humming under her skin, a strange, magnetic connection to the terrifying man before her. "I marked you," he said, his back still to her. "A partial claim. It has tethered you to me. It has stabilized you." He finally turned, his face a cold, unreadable mask. "And more importantly, it has stabilized me." The truth of her situation settled over her, cold and heavy as a shroud. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't a rescue. She was a cure, a tool, a living anchor for his broken wolf. All the humiliation, all the pain of the last day coalesced into a single, sharp point of pure, defiant rage. The field mouse was gone. It had died on that altar. "So that's it?" Her voice was quiet, but it didn't tremble. It was sharp, like a shard of glass. "You drag me here, brand me like livestock, and I'm just supposed to be your... what? Your pet? Your medicine?" A flicker of surprise crossed his features. It was there and gone in a second. He had expected tears, pleading. He had not expected this. "You will be cared for. You will have everything you could ever desire." "I desire a choice," she shot back, swinging her legs out of the bed, the linen gown doing little to hide her trembling. "I desire not to be a prisoner in a gilded cage. My life has been dictated by others for as long as I can remember. I will not let you be another one." She stood before him, small and fragile, but with a fire in her eyes he had not seen before. "I may be your anchor, Your Majesty, but an anchor has to be held by choice, or it is just a weight that will drown you." She lifted her chin. "If you want me, if you need me, you will treat me as more than just a mark on my skin." Darius stared down at her, the silence stretching between them, thick with tension. She expected him to lash out, to put her back in her place with a snarl and a show of power. Instead, a slow, dangerous smile touched the corner of his lips. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a wolf that has just found a creature far more interesting than it first believed. "Very well," he purred, the sound vibrating in her chest. "You will have your dignity, but you will play your part. You are now tied to the Alpha King, and you will be presented to my court as such. Let's see how your fire fares against them." Chapter 6, A Den of Vipers. They dressed her in silk the color of a midnight sky. It was a beautiful lie. A gown so fine it felt like water flowing over her skin, adorned with silver threads that shimmered like captured starlight. But to Celine, it felt like a cage. The borrowed jewels at her throat were a cold, heavy weight, a collar branding her as the king's property. This wasn't an introduction. It was an unveiling, a prized possession being put on display for a pack of hungry wolves. Following the silent command in Darius's eyes, she walked at his side into the royal hall. The room was a masterpiece of cold, brutalist grandeur, all dark stone, towering columns and flickering torchlight that made the shadows dance like living things, and it was filled with them. The nobles, the council members, the ancient, powerful families of the Blackthorn Kingdom. The moment they entered, the polite murmur of conversation died. It was replaced by a thick, ringing silence, 100 pairs of eyes fixing on her with a singular, unified hostility. She could feel their appraisal, their contempt, their dismissal. They saw nobody. A weak, rejected Omega from a backwater pack inexplicably clinging to the arm of their ruthless king. Her breath hitched, her instinct screaming at her to run, to hide, to become the field mouse again. Then she felt it. The warm, solid pressure of Darius's hand on the small of her back. It was not a tender gesture. It was a brand of ownership, a silent command to the room. She is mine. And it was a command to her, do not falter. A she-wolf detached herself from the crowd, moving with the fluid, predatory grace of a panther. She was stunningly beautiful, with fiery red hair and eyes the color of emeralds. Her scent was sharp, aggressive, pure alpha. This was a wolf who had never been told she was small in her entire life. "Your Majesty," the she-wolf purred, her eyes raking over Celine with disdain. "You have returned to us, and you have brought a stray." Darius's hand tightened on Celine's back. "Lyra," he acknowledged, his voice flat and cold as ice. "This is Celine. She is my guest." "A guest?" Lyra's laugh was like the tinkle of breaking glass. "How charming. We were all so concerned for you, my king. To hear you had been distracted by such a trivial matter in the Silver Moon Pack. We worried your grief was making you reckless." Her words were for him, but her venomous gaze was locked on Celine. She was speaking in code, her every syllable a threat. "You are nothing. You are temporary. He is ours." Celine's throat went dry. Her carefully constructed courage was crumbling, turning to ash under the heat of the she-wolf's hatred. This was a different kind of battlefield, one fought with whispers and smiles that were sharper than any claw. She was outmatched, outmaneuvered, and utterly alone. All she had was the grim, silent support of the monster at her side. For the rest of the night, she endured it. The polite, cutting questions, the looks that stripped her bare, the feeling of being an insect trapped under glass, scrutinized by creatures who could crush her without a second thought. She survived by focusing on the steady pressure of Darius's hand, the one solid thing in a swirling sea of hostility. When it was finally over, a servant, a young Omega with kind, nervous eyes, approached her as she retreated to her chambers. "My lady," she whispered, offering a steaming cup. "Some herbal tea, to help you rest." Celine took the cup, her hands trembling with exhaustion. It smelled of chamomile and honey, a comforting, familiar scent. But beneath it, there was something else. Something bitter. Something wrong. It was a scent so faint a field mouse might miss it, but a healer would not. Chapter 7. A Taste of Nightshade. From the shadows of his study, Darius watched them. He tracked the movements of his court on a sprawling map of the kingdom, but his mind's eye was in the royal hall. He had seen the way they looked at her. Lyra, with her possessive, spitting fury, the old wolves on his council, with their cold, calculating assessments. They saw the girl, Celine, not as a person, but as a weakness, a crack in his armor, an opportunity. He knew, with the certainty of a king who has survived 1,000 political battles, that they would test her. They would move against her to get to him, because that is what vipers do. He expected her to break. He had felt her terror through the incomplete bond between them, a frantic, fluttering panic that was as irritating as a fly buzzing in his ear. She had fire, yes, but it was the fire of a cornered kitten, not a dragon. He expected to be summoned to her chambers to find her in tears, begging to be sent away. He was already preparing the cold, hard words he would use to deny her. She was his cure. Her comfort was irrelevant. The bond was a constant, low hum in the back of his mind, a connection he was still learning to decipher. It was a tether to the beast inside him, keeping it from its worst rages. But it was also a tether to her. After she left the hall, he felt the thrum of her panic slowly, impossibly, recede. It was replaced by a quiet, focused calm that was so at odds with what she had just endured, it pricked his curiosity. Hours passed. The castle settled into a deep, sleeping silence. But the humming connection to her shifted again. A subtle wrongness, a flicker of alarm, sharp and cold. It wasn't panic. It was danger. His wolf, the beast that had been soothed by her very presence, stirred in his chest with a low, protective growl. He found himself moving, his feet carrying him through the silent stone corridors toward her chambers without a conscious command. He did not knock. Kings do not knock. He pushed the heavy oak door open and stopped dead. The room was not a place of tears. It was a makeshift apothecary. Celine was on the floor, her borrowed silk gown hiked up around her knees, surrounded by herbs she must have scavenged from the castle gardens. Her brow was furrowed in intense concentration, her hands working with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. The air smelled of crushed leaves and damp earth, and something else, something bitter. His eyes fell on a teacup on the bedside table, its contents poured out onto the stone floor. Even from the doorway, his keen senses could identify the faint, toxic scent. Nightshade. A poison favored by assassins for its quiet, creeping lethality. He looked from the poisoned cup to the girl grinding out an antidote with the focus of a master healer. She hadn't run to him. She hadn't screamed for help. She hadn't even cried. She had saved herself. A strange, unfamiliar feeling moved through him. It was not possession. It was not irritation. It was a flicker of something that felt dangerously like respect. As the thought formed, the bond between them flared white-hot. It was not a gentle hum, but a violent, searing agony. The world tilted, and he was no longer in her room. He was somewhere else, somewhere cold and dark, the scent of blood thick in the air. He saw his own hands, covered in gore, his claws extended, and he saw the terrified, dying eyes of his first mate staring up at him. Just before his wolf, lost to its rage, delivered the final, fatal blow. The vision, the memory, the raw agony of it hit him, but he felt it through her senses. She was seeing it. She was feeling his deepest shame. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. Chapter 8. The Wolf and the Anchor. The library was her only sanctuary. Celine huddled in a remote alcove, surrounded by the comforting, dusty scent of 1,000 forgotten stories. The ghost of the vision, Darius's vision, still clung to her, a horrifying, tragic secret that now lived inside her. She had seen the moment his wolf broke, the moment grief had turned a king into a monster. It explained so much, and it made him so much more terrifying, because she understood the depths of the rage he fought to control, a rage she was now tied to. Her mother's journal was open on her lap, its strange silver symbols seeming to mock her. What are you? What do you mean? Her desperation for answers had become a physical ache. Kale had called her bloodline cursed. Darius had said it made her susceptible. But the brief, strange glow she'd seen on her own fingertips when identifying the nightshade, that didn't feel like a curse. It felt like power. A power this book was supposed to explain. She traced one of the glowing glyphs with her finger, pouring all of her focus into it, trying to will it to give up its secrets. Nothing. It remained a beautiful, frustrating enigma. A low, familiar hum started at the base of her neck. The mark. She had grown used to its gentle warmth, a constant reminder of her connection to the king. But this was different. The hum was escalating, growing hotter. Within seconds, it was a searing, agonizing fire. A scream tore from her throat as she clutched at her neck, the pain blinding. It wasn't her pain, it was his. The bond was no longer a quiet stream. It was a raging river of pure, undiluted agony pouring from his soul directly into hers. She could feel him, the frustration, the grief, the self-hatred, and beneath it all, the wolf, the broken, raging beast from the vision, clawing its way to the surface. He was losing control. Her first instinct was to run, to hide, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the man who was about to become a monster. But another instinct, deeper and more powerful, rose to meet her fear. It was a fierce, protective urge that made no sense. He was her captor, her jailer, but he was also hers, and he was in pain. She followed the agony. It was a psychic beacon, pulling her through the winding corridors of the castle, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. The pain grew stronger with every step, so intense it made her vision swim. It led her to his study. The heavy door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open and her breath caught. He was a caged animal. He stood behind his massive desk, his body rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge. The wood was groaning under the pressure, splintering from the force of his claws, which had pierced through the skin of his fingertips. A low, continuous growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure, primal torment. His eyes were closed, his head thrown back, his face a mask of sweat and anguish as he fought a losing battle against the beast within. Terror seized her. This was the monster from the vision, the wolf that had killed its own mate. It would kill her without a thought. But she didn't run. Taking a shaky breath, she stepped into the room. Slowly, deliberately. She walked around the desk until she stood before him. He didn't seem to notice her, lost in his own personal hell. Hesitantly, her hands trembling, she reached out. She placed her palms flat against his heaving chest. The moment she touched him, a jolt of energy, cool and silver like moonlight, flowed from her hands into him. The violent rage that had been pouring through the bond faltered. The growl in his chest hitched. His eyes snapped open, no longer the cold gray of the king, but the blazing gold of his wolf. He stared at her, not with rage, but with a shocked, desperate recognition. She kept her hands there, pouring her own calm, her own essence into him. The raging inferno of his wolf didn't vanish, but it receded, the flames banking, the storm quieting. He was the wolf. She was the anchor. The immense tension in his body finally broke. With a shuddering groan, he collapsed forward, his great weight slumping against her. She staggered but held firm. His head rested in the crook of her neck, the very place he had marked her. He was exhausted, vulnerable. And for the first time since she had met him, the cold, ruthless king was gone, replaced by a broken man who clung to her as if she were the only solid thing in a world made of fire. Chapter 9. A Kiss of Fire and Fury. The formal banquet was just another battlefield. Days after the incident in his study, the fragile truce between them held, thin as ice over a deep, dark lake. Darius had not mentioned his moment of weakness, and Selene had not mentioned the horrifying vision she'd witnessed. They existed in a state of charged silence, the unspoken secrets a chasm between them. Now, he had insisted she attend this banquet, a political necessity to show a united front. To Selene, it felt like being paraded in front of the vipers again, and the midnight blue silk of her gown felt less like armor and more like a target. She stood by his side, a silent, ornamental thing, while he spoke in low, dangerous tones with his counsel. The air was thick with the scent of wine, roasted pheasant, and the cloying perfumes of the court nobles. And jealousy. It was a sharp, bitter scent rolling off Lyra, who watched them from across the room with narrowed emerald eyes. Suddenly, a wave of heat washed over Selene. It started deep in her belly, a confusing, coiling warmth that had nothing to do with the roaring fireplaces. The mark on her neck began to prickle, then burn. It was the bond, flaring to life in the middle of the crowded hall. Her cheeks flushed, her breath hitched, and a fine sheen of sweat broke out on her skin. What was happening? She glanced at Darius and saw his jaw was clenched, a muscle twitching violently. He was feeling it too. It was his control, his iron will, fighting against some unseen turmoil. And the backlash was hitting her. Whispers erupted around them. Heads turned. They saw her flushed face, her panting breaths. They saw the rigid control in their king. Lyra's lips curled into a triumphant, knowing smirk. This was a spectacle. A confirmation of the strange, unstable connection between their king and his little Omega stray. Darius's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her arm like a manacle of steel. "She is unwell," he announced to the room, his voice a thunderclap that cut through the whispers. "She requires air." He didn't wait for a response. He pulled her from the room, his long strides forcing her to practically run to keep up. He didn't stop in the corridor. He dragged her into a small private study, the scent of old leather and his own ozone-rich fury filling the space as he slammed the door shut behind them. "What was that?" she gasped, ripping her arm from his grasp, the heat inside her now mingling with pure, hot anger. "That little performance? You humiliated me." "I saved you from humiliation," he snarled, his stormy eyes blazing. He advanced on her, backing her up against the heavy oak desk. "Did you prefer I let them stare and whisper? Let them see how a connection makes a public spectacle of you, of me. So this is all about your pride, she shot back, her voice trembling but defiant. She poked a finger into his solid chest. The great Alpha King can't be seen to be affected by a little Omega he dragged here against her will? You are not little, he growled, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous purr. His gaze fell to her lips, and the air between them crackled, the heat from the bond intensifying until it was an inferno. And you are not here against your will. You are here because you are mine, because without me you would be dead. The injustice of it, the truth of it, the sheer arrogance of it all shattered her control. I hate you, she whispered, the words raw with pain. Liar, he rasped. And then his mouth was on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a punishment, a claim, a desperate collision of fire and fury. It was all the unspoken words, all the tension, all the rage and fear and reluctant need between them poured into one searing, brutal act. She fought him for a moment, her hands pushing against his chest, but it was like pushing against a mountain. And then, a traitorous liquid heat pooled low in her belly, and she wasn't fighting him anymore. She was kissing him back, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, answering his raw hunger with a desperate, starved craving of her own. The kiss was a raw, uncontrollable force, and it changed everything. Chapter 10. A Garden of Truth and Venom. The king was changing. Darius stood on a balcony overlooking the castle's moon-dusted gardens, the cold night air doing little to cool the fire in his blood. That kiss, it had been a mistake. A catastrophic lapse in the control that had defined his entire life. He had meant to intimidate her, to reassert his dominance. Instead, he had revealed the one thing he could not afford to, his own desperate, undeniable hunger for her. He had tasted her, and now his wolf and the man only wanted more. He had spent years building a fortress of ice around his heart, because the alternative was the raging, broken beast that had destroyed his first mate. Love was weakness. Love was a vulnerability his enemies could exploit. And this girl, this Celine, was a threat to every wall he had ever built. His wolf paced restlessly under his skin. Our mate. Go to her. Protect her. The instinct was a constant, maddening drumbeat. He was the king. He did not need. He did not want. He did not feel. But it was a lie. He was beginning to feel all three. A flicker of movement in the garden below snagged his attention. A flash of white, Celine's nightgown. She was walking near the rose bushes, a lone, fragile figure in the darkness. He felt a surge of possessive satisfaction seeing her there, in his gardens, in his home. And then he saw the second figure emerge from the shadows. Ice flooded his veins. It was the boy, Kale, the sniveling alpha who had rejected her. He looked wrong. His clothes were disheveled, his eyes wild with a feverish obsession. Darius didn't need to hear the words to know this was a confrontation. He saw the way Kale grabbed her arm, the way Celine flinched back. A growl, low and lethal, tore from Darius's chest. He didn't use the stairs. He vaulted over the stone balcony, landing silently on the grass below, a phantom of pure, unleashed fury. As he moved through the shadows, Kale's desperate, snarling words reached him. Supposed to be mine, a useless, weak thing I could control. I was never weak, Celine's voice shot back, clear and cold. Kyle laughed, a ragged, unhinged sound. Not born weak, no. Made weak. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper that carried on the night air. Did you ever wonder why you were always so tired, so small? Why your wolf was so quiet? My father was terrified of your mother's bloodline. Terrified of what you might become. He had the old healer dosing your food with herbs since you were a child. Wolfsbane, silverroot, just enough to keep your power suppressed, to keep you a quiet, manageable little Omega. Darius froze. The world stopped. Poisoned. They had been poisoning his mate her entire life. He saw Kale lean in, trying to kiss her, and the last thread of the king's control snapped. He exploded from the shadows. He was on Kale in a heartbeat, a blur of rage and violence. He slammed the younger alpha against a stone wall, the sound of bone cracking echoing in the silent garden. A feral snarl ripped from his throat as his claws elongated, ready to tear the boy's throat out. He would kill him. He would rip him apart for daring to touch her, for daring to harm her. "Darius, stop!" Her voice cut through his red haze. It was the only sound in the world that could have reached him. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes blazing gold with his wolf's fury. Celine stood there, her face pale with shock, but her eyes were wide with a commanding fire he had never seen. "Let him go," she commanded. He was the Alpha King. He took orders from no one, but his claws slowly, reluctantly, retracted. He dropped the gasping, broken Alpha to the ground, his chest heaving with the force of his contained violence. He had nearly killed him, and he had stopped only because she had told him to. The realization was as shocking as the truth she had just learned. Chapter 11. The King's Vigil. A lifetime of lies. That was the thought that echoed in the vast, silent chambers of Celine's mind. She sat by the window, the moon a cold silver eye in the sky, watching over a world that no longer made sense. She wasn't weak. She had never been weak. She had been poisoned, suppressed, and shackled by the very people who were supposed to protect her. The knowledge was a bitter pill, but beneath the bitterness, something else was taking root. A cold, hard seed of rage, a rage that felt like her own. What could she have been, if not for them? Who was she, really? The questions were a dizzying abyss. Her mother's journal, resting on the table, seemed to pulse with a new, urgent light. The glowing symbols were no longer just a curiosity. They were a map to a self she had never been allowed to know. Kyle was gone, banished from the kingdom by Darius with a quiet, terrifying finality. But the consequences of his revelation remained, poisoning the air. Whispers slithered through the castle corridors like snakes. Lyra and her allies on the council saw the king's violent defense of Celine not as a mark of strength, but as a sign of his growing weakness. His obsession. They began to move more openly now, their plots taking on a sharper, more dangerous edge. Lyra spread rumors that Celine's cursed bloodline was unstable, that it was affecting the king's mind. Celine felt like a pawn in a game whose rules she was only just beginning to understand. A game where she was both the prize and the target. She had expected Darius to retreat back into his cold, aloof shell after the incident in the garden. She expected the distance between them to grow, for him to lock away the vulnerability he had shown. He did the opposite. That night, she was drifting in a restless sleep when the sound of her chamber door opening startled her awake. She sat bolt upright, her heart pounding, ready for an assassin in the shadows. But it was him. Darius stood in the doorway, a massive silhouette against the dim light of the corridor. He was dressed for sleep, wearing only a pair of dark trousers. He said nothing. He simply walked to the large, plush armchair near the fireplace, sat down, and watched her. Her breath caught. "What are you doing?" she whispered into the darkness. "Sleeping," he answered, his voice a low rumble. But he didn't sleep. He just sat there, a silent, brooding guardian, a king holding vigil. His presence was overwhelming, a mix of terrifying power and an almost unbearable intimacy. This was not the act of a captor. This was the act of a protector. He was there because he knew she was a target, and he trusted no one else to keep her safe. And so it began. Every night, he would enter her chambers in silence. He never approached the bed. He never touched her. He simply took his place in the armchair, a silent, watchful shadow, and stayed until dawn. The vast space between the bed and the chair was filled with 1,000 unspoken things. His growing need, her confusing gratitude, their undeniable magnetic pull. In the quiet darkness of those long nights, surrounded by the scent of his power, Selene felt the last of her fear of him begin to melt away. It was replaced by something far more complicated, something that felt dangerously like affection for the broken, ruthless king who had somehow become her silent, steadfast guardian. Chapter 12. A Storm of Souls. The storm broke with the fury of a dying god. Rain lashed against the stone castle in horizontal sheets, and thunder cracked the sky, each boom vibrating deep in Selene's bones. For weeks, Darius had kept his silent vigil in the armchair across from her bed, a brooding, watchful guardian. But tonight was different. The storm outside was a pale imitation of the one brewing inside the king. She could feel it through the bond, a rising tide of chaotic, violent energy that terrified her. He hadn't come to her room. That was the first sign something was wrong. Driven by a frantic worry she refused to name, she had sought him out, finding him in his study. He stood staring into the fireplace, the flames casting flickering, demonic shadows on his face. He was fighting it, hard. But his wolf, agitated by the storm, by the court's relentless pressure, by his own warring emotions, was winning. "You should go," he rasped, his voice a low, shredded thing. He didn't turn to look at her. "It is not safe. The beast is close." "I'm not leaving you," Selene said, her own voice quiet but firm. The girl who had once trembled in his presence was gone, replaced by the woman who had seen his pain. A guttural snarl ripped from his chest as his body arched, his knuckles white where he gripped the stone mantle. "Go!" The command was a blast of pure alpha power, designed to make any lesser wolf cower and obey. Selene flinched, but she held her ground, because beneath the rage, she could feel the raw terror. His terror. He wasn't afraid of what others would do to him. He was afraid of what he would do to others. He was afraid of the monster that had killed his first mate. He crashed to his knees, a raw, inhuman sound of agony tearing from his throat. His skin shimmered, his bones grinding as the change threatened to take him by force. This was it. He was losing. The beast was breaking its chains for good. In that moment, she didn't see a king or a monster. She saw a man being ripped apart from the inside. And the instinct that rose in her was no longer just protective. It was possessive. He was hers to save. She moved toward him, her fear a distant echo. She knelt in front of him, her hands hovering over his trembling shoulders. She remembered her mother's journal, the glowing symbols that felt like a familiar language she had forgotten. She remembered the strange silver light on her fingertips in the library. She didn't think. She just acted. She placed her hands on him, and this time she didn't just offer a calm anchor. She pushed. She poured her own essence, the strange, dormant, moon-touched power in her blood, down the bond and into him. Her hands began to glow, a soft, ethereal silver light that pulsed in time with the thunder outside. The light seeped into him, a cool balm on his burning soul. His violent shudders began to subside. The guttural growls softened into pained groans. He looked up, his eyes a swirling vortex of gold and gray, wolf and man, staring at her glowing hands with shocked disbelief. She was fighting the beast for him. She was grounding him, chaining the monster with ropes of moonlight. The storm in his soul finally broke. With a final shuddering gasp, he collapsed against her, his forehead resting on her shoulder. The fire was gone, leaving only a deep, aching exhaustion. He was shaking, not with rage, but with a profound, soul-deep relief. "Selene," he whispered, his voice raw. It was the first time he had said her name with anything other than command. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. The rain hammered against the windows, the thunder rolled, but in the heart of the storm, they were the calm, the shared vulnerability, the raw intimacy of her saving him, of him letting her see him so broken. It shattered the last of the walls between them. He lifted his head, his stormy eyes filled with a desperate, wondering gratitude she had never seen. And when he kissed her this time, There was no anger, no fury. There was only a desperate, starving need, a need she met with all the pieces of her own broken, healing heart. Chapter 13. The Serpent's Ledger. Peace was a foreign country. Darius awoke to the soft gray light of dawn filtering through the rain-streaked windows of Celine's chamber. For the first time in a decade, he had slept. A true, deep, dreamless sleep, untroubled by the howling of the beast within. The storm in his soul was gone, replaced by a profound humming calm, and the source of that peace was curled trustingly in his arms. Celine. She was still asleep, her breath a soft, warm puff against his chest. Her scent, moonflower and that wild, secret magic, was a balm to his scarred soul. Last night, she had faced his demon and had not flinched. She had saved him with a power he still didn't understand, a gentle, glowing light that had tamed the monster he'd kept chained for years. He had claimed her body afterward, an act of desperate, grateful passion, but he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that she had claimed his soul long before. This was more than a cure. This was everything. A cold, hard fury rose in him, sharp and clear in the newfound silence of his mind. They had tried to break this magnificent creature. They had poisoned her, suppressed her, called her weak. Kale's father, the old Alpha of Silvermoon, had orchestrated it. And Darius was going to find out why. Leaving Selena sleeping in the safety of her bed, he moved with the cold, silent purpose of a king on the hunt. He went to the dungeons where the former Alpha's personal effects had been stored after his banishment. It was a collection of papers, maps, and ledgers, the mundane records of a pack leader. But Darius was looking for something else, a secret. He found it hidden in the false bottom of a heavy wooden chest, a small leather-bound ledger, filled not with numbers, but with cryptic symbols. To Darius, they were meaningless scribbles, but he recognized the elegant, flowing style. It was the same script he had seen in the book Selene was always reading, her mother's journal. He brought the ledger back to his study, the sense of dread growing with every step. He sent for Selene. When she arrived, her eyes still soft with sleep and the memories of their night together, his heart ached with a fierce, protective instinct. He hated to shatter this fragile peace, but she had a right to know. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He pushed the ledger across the polished desk. Celine's breath hitched as she saw the symbols. She ran a trembling finger over a familiar glyph, one that looked like a weeping willow tree bathed in moonlight. "This is my mother's script, but it's not her journal." She opened it, her brow furrowed in concentration. The symbols were mostly a mystery, but some were interspersed with names and dates in the common tongue. And then she saw it. A series of entries, detailing payments. Large sums, transferred from Kale's father to a certain noble house within Darius's own kingdom. Next to each payment was a small, elegant symbol of a snake eating its own tail. And a name. Elara. The truth hit Selene like a physical blow. The rejection, the humiliation. It wasn't just Kale's cruelty or his father's fear. It had been a conspiracy, orchestrated, paid for. Her best friend, her sister in all but blood, had sold her. Elara had conspired with Kale's father and, it seemed, with a faction inside this very court, to have her destroyed. Why? For a title? For a mate who had never wanted Selene in the first place? The betrayal was so profound, so personal, it eclipsed everything else. Darius watched the color drain from her face, saw the dawning horror in her eyes. He reached across the desk, his hand covering hers. It was a simple gesture, but it was a promise. A vow. They had tried to poison her body. Then they had tried to poison her soul. And he would make every last one of them pay. Chapter 14. The King's Defiance. The council chamber felt like a tomb, a cold, silent place where ambition came to fester and loyalty came to die. Selene stood beside Darius's throne, not behind it. It was a small but significant shift. She was no longer a guest, she was a presence, a partner, and the old wolves of his council looked at her as if she were a disease that had infected their king. Following the discovery of the ledger, they had been summoned, all of them. Lord Valerius, the council elder with his cold reptilian eyes, the other nobles who now served Alara's family, and Lyra, who stood with them, her emerald eyes burning with a triumphant fire. They thought they had him cornered. "Your Majesty," Valerius began, his voice a dry rustle of old leaves. "We come to you out of concern, for the kingdom, for your own well-being. Spare me your feigned affections, Valerius." Darius's voice was dangerously quiet, a low rumble that promised violence. "Speak your mind before I lose what little patience I have left." Valerius's lips thinned. "Very well. This Omega." He gestured to Selene as if she were a piece of furniture. "Her presence has made you reckless. You banished the son of a powerful alpha without a trial. You have neglected your duties. Your instability is becoming a liability." Lyra stepped forward, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Darius, we all know you are still grieving. This girl with her cursed, unstable bloodline, she is a distraction, a pretty toy. But she is not a queen. The kingdom needs a strong Luna. It needs me." Selene stood her ground, her chin held high, but her heart hammered against her ribs. She was the battlefield upon which the war for this kingdom was being fought. Darius leaned forward in his throne, his silence more terrifying than any shout. He let their accusations hang in the dead air, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but every word was a shard of ice. "You speak of my duties," he began, his gaze sweeping over them, pinning each of them in turn. "My duty is to the strength of this kingdom. My duty is to the future of my bloodline. My duty is to my mate." He rose from his throne, a towering figure of absolute power. He walked down the steps until he stood directly in front of Selene. He took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers, a silent public declaration. Valerius sneered. "You would choose this nothing over your crown, over your people? Make your choice, king. Her or the throne." It was the ultimatum, the final move in their game. They had laid their trap, certain he would choose power. He had always chosen power. Darius looked from their greedy, expectant faces to Selene. He looked into her eyes and saw not a curse but a cure, not a weakness but a strength he had never known. He saw his future, his everything. He turned back to his council, his face set like granite. His voice rang out in the silent tomb of a room, a vow and a death sentence all in one. "Then let me be clear." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "I would burn this kingdom to the ground and dance on its ashes before I ever gave her up." It was his point of no return, a declaration of love that was also a declaration of war. The council stared, their faces masks of shock and fury. They had lost. Their king was no longer their own. And as Selene's heart swelled with a fierce, powerful love for the man who would sacrifice a throne for her, she felt a sudden, cold spike of alarm through the bond. It was not his emotion. It was a warning, a premonition. Footsteps. Soft. Stealthy. In the corridors outside, assassins. They were already in the castle. Forward chapter 15. A vow written in blood. The world exploded in steel and shadow. Selene's warning cry was still on her lips when the tapestries on the far wall ripped apart, assassins pouring into the council chamber like spiders from a disturbed nest. They wore no colors, no insignia, just dark leather and the blank, merciless faces of men who killed for coin. Lord Valerius and the other treacherous nobles scrambled back, their faces masks of feigned shock. Liars. All of them. Darius moved before the first assassin's foot hit the floor. He was no longer a king in a throne room. He was a primal force of violence. He shoved Celine behind him, his body a living shield, and met the first attacker with a roar that was pure wolf. A flash of steel, a sickening crunch of bone, and the man fell, his throat a ruined mess. Chaos erupted. The few loyal royal guards were outnumbered, locked in desperate combat. Darius was a whirlwind of death, his movements a brutal, efficient dance. He fought with the calculated fury of a king and the savage instinct of an alpha. Fangs and claws were not needed when his fists could shatter jaws, and his speed could outpace a striking snake. He was magnificent, he was terrifying, and he was fighting for her. But there were too many. While Darius engaged two attackers at once, a third wraith-like figure slipped past his guard, a thin, dark blade clutched in his hand. He was coming for Celine. There was no time to think, no time to scream for help. The helpless Omega, who had collapsed at an altar of rejection, was gone. In her place was a she-wolf defending her mate. Celine snatched a heavy silver letter opener from a nearby desk, a pathetic weapon, but it was something. As the assassin lunged, she sidestepped and drove the blunt point into the soft spot under his jaw. He grunted in pained surprise, his lunge faltering just enough. It was the opening Darius needed. He spun, his arm a blur, and snapped the assassin's neck with a sharp, final crack. But in that split second of turning, he had left himself exposed. Another assassin, one who had been waiting for just this moment, surged forward. His blade was coated in a viscous, black substance that seemed to drink the light. "Darius!" Celine screamed. He twisted, but he wasn't fast enough. The blade sank deep into his side, just below the ribs. Darius grunted, a sharp intake of breath, and then drove his elbow back into the man's face with bone-shattering force. The man crumpled. The room fell silent. All the remaining assassins were dead or dying. Darius stood tall for a moment, his chest heaving. He looked at Celine, a flicker of fierce pride in his eyes. Then his legs buckled. She caught him, his immense weight nearly crushing her. "Darius!" she cried, lowering him to the cold stone floor. Blood was already soaking through his tunic, a shocking, vibrant crimson. It was a deep wound, but a wolf of his power should have already been healing. "The blade," he rasped, his hand clamping over his side. His face was pale, beaded with sweat. "Poison. It stops the healing." His wolf was raging inside him, a desperate, powerful beast fighting to heal its master. But the poison was like a gag in its throat. He was trapped in his human form, bleeding like any mortal man. And as Celine frantically pressed her hands to the wound, her mind reeling with the scent of his blood and the chilling realization of their enemy's cunning, she could hear them. The heavy, armored footsteps of the council's guards, storming the chamber not as rescuers, but as executioners. Chapter 16. The Weight of a Curse. They were trapped. The scent of blood, his blood, was thick in the air, a coppery perfume of her worst fears realized. Celine knelt on the cold floor, her hands soaked in the life draining out of her king, her mate. His breathing was shallow, his powerful body trembling with a weakness that felt unnatural, profane. The heavy tread of armored boots echoed from the corridor, sealing their doom. The doors to the council chamber swung open, but it was not the royal guard that entered. It was Lord Valerius, flanked by Lyra and a dozen of the council's personal guard, their spears lowered, their faces grim and triumphant. They moved to form a semicircle around them, a cage of hostile steel. "Well, well," Valerius said, his voice dripping with false sorrow as he looked down at the bleeding king. "What a tragedy. The king, overcome by his madness, slaughters his own council members and is wounded in the process. A sad day for the kingdom." Lyra stared at Darius, a flicker of something, regret, satisfaction, in her emerald eyes before her gaze settled on Celine, hard and cold as stone. "Get away from him, you cursed thing," Lyra spat. You have done enough damage. Selene ignored her, her focus solely on Darius, on the blood that was still seeping between her fingers, on the life she could feel fading from him. He needs a healer, she cried out, her voice raw with desperation. Valerius chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. Oh, I think not. His fate is sealed. But it is your fate, little Omega, that is so much more interesting. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over them. He looked down at her, his reptilian eyes gleaming with a terrible, gloating light. You see, Kale's father was not just a fearful man. He was a scholar of the old lines. He knew what your mother was, and he knew the truth of your bloodline. He crouched down, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The power you carry isn't a gift, girl. It is a failsafe, a doomsday switch. It is a curse bound to the very land itself. Your mother's death caused a blight that starved hundreds, and your death He smiled, a terrible, bloodless expression. Your death will unleash a plague, a creeping, blood-rotting sickness that will sweep through this kingdom and kill thousands. There will be chaos, panic. The people will demand a new, strong leader to guide them through the darkness. The world tilted and fell away. The roaring in Selene's ears drowned out the sound of Darius's ragged breaths. It wasn't just her. Her life wasn't just her own to lose. Her very existence was a threat, and her death was a weapon they fully intended to use. No one will mourn a useless, rejected Omega who drove their king mad, Valerius continued, rising to his full height. They will curse your memory. We will kill you, blame the resulting plague on the instability of the king's rule, and I will step in to restore order. He had laid it all bare, the sheer diabolical scope of their plan, to murder her, to use her corpse as a biological weapon, to seize the throne from the ashes of the kingdom they would burn. Selene stared at her hands, covered in the blood of the only person who had ever seen her as more than a curse, more than a tool. She was trapped. Her mate was dying, and she had just learned that her very existence was a mistake, a plague waiting to happen. The despair was absolute, a cold, crushing weight that extinguished every last spark of hope within her. Chapter 17. The Queen is Born. The world had narrowed to the space of a single ragged breath, Darius's breath. His head was in her lap, his great body shuddering. The life was leaving him, a flickering candle flame in a rising wind. His stormy eyes, clouded with pain, found hers. He lifted a trembling hand, his fingers brushing her cheek, smearing his own blood on her skin. I would have, he whispered, his voice a shredded remnant of its former power. Burned the world for you. His words struck the core of her. They were not the words of a king to a possession. They were the words of a man to his equal, his everything. In a lifetime of being told she was worthless, useless, cursed. He, the most powerful man in the world, had looked at her and seen something worth sacrificing a kingdom for. He saw her as worthy. And in that moment, something inside her broke. Or maybe it was finally forged. She looked up at Lord Valerius and his guards, at their smug, victorious faces. She saw the sneer on Lyra's lips. They were all waiting for her to weep, to beg, to die like the helpless, cursed Omega they believed her to be. She had believed it too. For her entire life she had carried that belief like a shroud, a heavy, suffocating weight that defined her every move. The belief that she was small, that she was worthless, that she was a mistake. It was a lie. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and fell, landing on Darius's chest right over his heart. She closed her eyes, and the roaring chaos of the room fell away, replaced by a sudden, profound silence in her soul. She confronted her deepest fear, her oldest enemy, the terrified little girl inside who had believed them. I am not helpless. The thought was not a shout. It was a whisper that shook the foundations of her world. I was never helpless. I was waiting. Her mother's words from the journal, words she had never understood, echoed in her mind. The moon does not fight. It does not rage. It commands the tides with its silent, steady light. She was her mother's daughter. She was the last of a bloodline that terrified alphas, and she was the mate of a king who was dying at her feet. The quiet, apologetic Omega who had lived her life in the shadows. She died in that moment, her ashes scattered on the cold stone floor, and from those ashes, a queen was born. Celine opened her eyes. The despair was gone, replaced by a calm so deep and cold it was terrifying. Her grief was still there, a sharp, hard diamond in her chest, but it was no longer a weakness. It was fuel. She looked down at Darius, at his pale, beautiful face, and made a vow. They would not have him. They would not use her. This would not be how their story ended. A faint, ethereal glow began to radiate from her body. It started at her heart, a soft, silver pulse that matched the rhythm of the moon outside. With every beat of her newfound resolve, the light grew brighter, warmer, pulsing outward, a silent, steady light in the gathering dark. Chapter 18. The Tide of Moonlight. The light was everything. It poured from Celine, a silent silver nova that pushed back the shadows and the despair. It was not a fire. It was not a weapon. It was the calm, irrefutable power of the full moon given form, a tide of pure life energy that had been suppressed within her for years. Lord Valerius and his guards took a stunned, stumbling step back, shielding their eyes from the impossible radiance. Lyra's sneer had frozen into a mask of shocked disbelief. They had expected tears. They had expected death. They had not expected a miracle. But Celine did not see them. Her world had narrowed to the dying man in her arms. The silver light pulsed from her heart, down her arms, and into her hands, which she laid flat against the bloody, poisoned wound in Darius's side. The light was cool to the touch, like clean water, and it smelled of night-blooming jasmine and ancient, forgotten magic. She pushed her power into him, not with frantic desperation, but with a quiet, steady command. Lev. The effect was instantaneous. Where her light touched him, the dark, viscous poison sizzled and dissolved into harmless smoke. The torn flesh began to knit itself back together, the skin sealing without a scar. The unnatural pallor of his face was replaced by a healthy, vital warmth. Color flooded back into his lips. His ragged, shallow breaths deepened into a slow, steady rhythm. The gaping, fatal wound was gone, but the light did not stop there. It flowed deeper, past the mended flesh, sinking into his very soul. It sought out the broken, raging beast he had kept chained in his heart for a decade. It found the jagged edges of his grief, the festering wound of his self-hatred, and it soothed them. It did not erase the scars. It healed them. The fractured pieces of his wolf, of his spirit, were gently, inexorably drawn back together. The constant howling storm in his soul fell silent. He was whole. His eyes fluttered open. The stormy gray was gone, replaced by a pure, clear silver, a perfect reflection of the moonlight she now commanded. He looked at her, not with the pained gratitude of a man saved from death, but with the profound, soul-shaking awe of a man who has just witnessed the divine. The silver light receded, drawing back into Celine, leaving the council chamber in a stunned, ringing silence. Darius sat up, his movements fluid and strong. He was not just healed, he was remade. The restless, violent energy that had always clung to him was gone, replaced by a deep, calm well of power. He was more dangerous than ever because he was no longer broken. He looked at the shocked faces of his enemies. He looked at the blood on the floor. Then he looked at Celine. And the Alpha King of the Blackthorn Kingdom, the ruthless, merciless ruler who bowed to no one, who had never knelt for anyone in his life, slowly, deliberately, went down on one knee before her. He took her hand, the one not covered in his blood, and pressed his forehead to her knuckles. His voice, when he spoke, was not for the council. It was for her alone, a low, reverent vow that remade their world. My queen. The words echoed in the silence, a thunderclap far more powerful than any storm. He was not her king. He was not her captor. He was hers, utterly and completely. And in the face of that stunning devotion, the rebellion began to truly die. Chapter 19. A United Front. The king's reverence was a more powerful weapon than any sword. From his new vantage point, kneeling on the cold stone, Darius saw the full effect of his submission. He watched the treacherous nobles, their faces pale with a new kind of fear. They had planned to fight a broken, unstable tyrant. They had not planned to face a goddess and her devoted king. He felt the shift in the room, the crumbling of their resolve, the dawning, terrified understanding that the game was over. He rose to his feet, pulling Celine up with him. Her hand in his was a perfect fit, the source of the impossible calm that now filled him. For the first time, he did not feel the need to shield her. He stood beside her, an equal, a partner. His wolf, now a silent, powerful presence in perfect harmony with him, purred in agreement. Our queen. Our heart. The doors to the chamber burst open again, but this time it was his royal guard, the few who had fought their way through the castle. They skidded to a halt, their faces grim, expecting to find their king dead or dying. Instead, they found him standing whole and hale, his hand linked with the radiant Omega who had once been the subject of their scorn. Their commander, a grizzled old wolf named Marcus, stared, his jaw slack. "Your Majesty, you are healed." "Thanks to my queen," Darius said, his voice ringing with an authority that was absolute. There was no room for argument, no room for doubt. It was a statement of fact. Marcus and the other guards looked at Celine, truly looked at her, for the first time. They saw not a stray, not a weakness, but the source of their king's impossible recovery. They saw the faint residual silver light that seemed to cling to her skin. They saw the unwavering strength in her eyes, and one by one, they dropped to a knee, their heads bowed not just to their king, but to her. The awe in the room was a palpable force, a wave of reverence that washed away the last vestiges of the council's authority. "Valerius." Darius's voice was soft, but it cut through the silence like a razor. "You and your co-conspirators are guilty of high treason. You attempted to murder your king, and you conspired to murder the future of this kingdom." He squeezed Celine's hand. They didn't need to speak. The bond between them was a silent, perfect conduit of thought and intent. "What is your judgment, my heart?" She looked at the cowering nobles, at the furious but defeated Lyra. The old Celine would have wanted mercy. But the queen knew that mercy to serpents was cruelty to their victims. She met his eyes and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Justice." "Marcus," Darius commanded, his eyes never leaving Celine's. "Take them to the dungeons. All of them. They will await their trial." As the loyal guards hauled the sputtering, protesting nobles away, a new sense of purpose filled the room. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the battle was not over. The council's forces, the soldiers loyal to the treacherous houses, still held much of the castle. Darius turned to Celine, his voice a low murmur for her alone. "Are you ready for this?" She looked at the blood on the floor, the sigil of their trial by fire. She looked at the loyal soldiers who now watched her with worshipful eyes. She looked at the man beside her, her mate, her king, whole and healed and hers. She was no longer a healer hiding in a hut. She was no longer a victim on an altar. She was a queen who had just saved her king. "I am," she said, her voice clear and strong. Together, a united, unstoppable front, they turned and walked out of the council chamber, their bond a silent command center, ready to take back their home. Chapter 20. The Queen's Gambit. The battle for the castle was not a grand, sweeping affair. It was a series of brutal, intimate clashes in the torchlit corridors and shadowed courtyards. And at the heart of it all were the king and his queen. They moved as one, a seamless fusion of shadow and light. Darius was a controlled storm, a perfect, deadly force. There was no wasted motion, no hint of the frenzied rage that had once driven him. His wolf, now his partner instead of his prisoner, guided his movements with preternatural grace and lethal precision. He flowed through the rebel soldiers like a river of death, his fists and feet striking with the force of a battering ram, his silver eyes missing nothing. He was not just a warrior, he was a king reclaiming his domain, and his certainty was terrifying to behold. Celine fought beside him. She was not a warrior of steel, but of spirit. As Darius engaged the enemy, a whirlwind of controlled violence, she became the eye of the storm. Her hands, once used to grind herbs, now wove shields of soft, silver light that deflected incoming arrows and sword strokes aimed at their guards. The light was a tangible thing, a shimmering barrier that the rebels' weapons could not penetrate. When one of their loyal soldiers fell, a spear wound in his shoulder, Celine was there in an instant. She knelt, her hands glowing, and pressed her palms to the injury. The soldier gasped as the pain vanished, the wound sealing before his very eyes. He looked at her with stunned, grateful reverence before scrambling back to his feet to rejoin the fight. She was not just a shield, she was their miracle. A healer on a battlefield, turning the tide not by taking lives, but by saving them. The rebel soldiers, men loyal to houses like Valerius and Lyra, had been told they were fighting to free the kingdom from a mad king and his manipulative consort. But what they saw was not a monster. They saw a king of immense, controlled power, fighting with perfect clarity. And they saw a queen whose magic was not a curse, but a divine blessing of protection and healing. Doubt began to poison their resolve. Their morale began to crumble. They reached the Great Hall, the heart of the rebellion, where the last and most numerous contingent of the council's forces were gathered. At their head stood a grim-faced captain, a man sworn to Lord Valerius. Behind their ranks, held between two guards, was a pale, terrified Kale, dragged from the dungeons to be used as some final, pathetic pawn. The captain raised his sword. "For the good of the kingdom, down with the tyrant!" His men surged forward, a wave of steel and desperation. Darius met their charge, a bulwark of unyielding force. But Celine stepped forward with him. She raised her hands, and the silver light that emanated from her didn't form a shield this time. It exploded outward, a brilliant, blinding nova of pure white light. It wasn't harmful, but it was overwhelming. The charging soldiers cried out, stumbling back, their vision completely whited out. The charge broke. Confusion turned to panic. They were fighting a force beyond their comprehension. In the momentary blindness, Darius moved. He disarmed the captain and had a blade to his throat before anyone knew what had happened. The fighting stopped. Kyle, forgotten by his captors, stared at Celine, his face a mask of utter, terrified disbelief. He was looking at the quiet, useless Omega he had tried to destroy, but the girl he had known was gone. In her place stood a luminous, powerful queen, her hand resting on the shoulder of her king, her calm gaze holding the fate of every man in the room. This was not the end he had envisioned. This was his utter ruin. Chapter 21. A Judgment of Silver and Ash. The Great Hall was a place of judgment. The battle was over, the rebels disarmed and kneeling, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. Darius stood with his blade still at the captain's throat, a silent, lethal king who had reclaimed his throne. But his eyes were on Celine, and the question in them was clear. What is your will? This was not his victory to claim alone. It was theirs. Celine's gaze moved past the defeated soldiers, past the trembling, captured captain, and settled on Kale. He was on his knees, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a terror that was almost pathetic. He was looking at her as if she were a ghost, the ghost of the girl he had tried to crush. She walked toward him, her steps silent and measured on the stone floor. The remaining loyal guards parted for her like a river around a stone. She was no longer the apologetic field mouse. She was a queen, and she moved with the calm, inexorable gravity of the moon commanding the tides. She stopped before Kale. He flinched, expecting a blow, a curse, an executioner's strike. "You called my bloodline a curse," Celine said, her voice not loud, but it carried through the cavernous, silent hall. It was a voice of pure, cold clarity. "You were right. It is. But a curse is just a tool, Kale. and its purpose depends entirely on the one who wields it. Kale began to tremble, whimpering. Please, Celine. I was a fool. You were cruel, she corrected him, her voice devoid of heat, devoid of pity. You sought to wound me in the deepest way a wolf can be wounded. You wanted me to live in a prison of endless soul-deep agony, a pain you could never possibly comprehend. She paused, a flicker of silver light gathering in her palm. It was not the warm, healing light from before. This was a cold, sharp, brilliant light, like a shard of a distant star. But I think it's time you learned. She reached out and gently touched her glowing fingertips to his forehead. Kyle screamed. It was not a sound of physical pain. It was a raw, animalistic howl of pure, spiritual agony. He clutched at his chest, his body convulsing as the phantom, searing pain of 1,000 broken bonds flooded his soul. She had not killed him. She had not even harmed him physically. She had simply turned his own venom back on him. She had cursed him with the very pain he had inflicted on her. His wolf would now howl for a mate it could never have. He would feel the constant, gnawing emptiness, the searing pain of rejection every single day for the rest of his miserable life. It was a fate far crueler than a swift, clean death. It was a prison made of his own sins. Celine pulled her hand back, the light fading. She looked down at the writhing, weeping alpha on the floor and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no pity, just closure. She turned her back on him and faced the rest of the rebels. She was no longer just the king's consort. She was a power in her own right, one who could deliver a justice that was both terrifying and absolute. The core emotional question of her life had been answered. The girl who had been told she was worthless and weak had found the strength to save not only herself, but to deliver a judgment that would reshape the future of the kingdom. And as Darius watched her, his heart filled with a love so fierce it was an ache in his chest, he knew the world had just witnessed the birth of its true queen. Chapter 22. The Queen's Peace. In the aftermath of the battle, a new order began to take shape, forged in the light of Celene's power and the steel of Darius's resolve. The Great Hall, once a place of judgment, became a place of restoration. The traitors were led away in chains, their power broken, their houses stripped of titles and lands. The loyal were rewarded, their faith in their king vindicated. Darius watched it all, a silent, powerful presence at the center of the storm. But his true focus was on Celine. He observed as she moved among the wounded, her hands glowing with that soft silver light, her touch mending torn flesh and soothing frayed nerves. The soldiers, men who had once dismissed her, now looked at her with a reverence that bordered on worship. They called her Lady Moonlight, their blessed queen. They saw what he now knew to be true. She was not his weakness. She was the source of his newfound strength, the soul of his reclaimed kingdom. His wolf, now a calm and steady presence within him, was content for the first time in his memory. It no longer raged against the world. It simply watched over her, our heart, our home. The silence in his mind was the greatest gift she had given him, a peace he had thought forever lost. Later, as the hall was being cleared and order restored, a lone figure approached the throne where they sat. It was Lyra. Stripped of her finery, her fiery hair unbound and her face pale, she looked smaller, diminished. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated understanding. She stopped at the foot of the dais and slowly, stiffly, went to her knees. Her head bowed. "My queen." Lyra's voice was a hoarse whisper, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I was wrong. I was blinded by ambition and jealousy. I saw you as a threat to what I thought was my destiny." She looked up, and for the first time there was no venom in her emerald eyes, only a weary, grudging respect. "But a destiny that must be seized through treachery and murder is no destiny at all. You are what this kingdom needs, a healer, a uniter. She bowed her head again. I submit to your rule. My life is yours to command. Celine looked down at the she-wolf who had been her fiercest tormentor. There was no triumph in her heart, only a quiet, somber sense of an ending. A chapter of her life defined by the cruelty and ambition of others was finally, truly, over. Rise, Lady Lyra, Celine said, her voice gentle but firm. Your life is your own, but from this day forward, you will use it to serve the people of this kingdom. You will help rebuild what you helped to tear down. That will be your penance and your path to redemption. Lyra looked up, shocked by the mercy, by the wisdom. She gave a single sharp nod, a new kind of loyalty dawning in her eyes. As she rose and retreated, a new era began. The old court, with its vipers and its schemes, was dead. Darius reached over and took Celine's hand, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. He didn't need to speak. She could feel his pride, his love, his unwavering support flooding through the bond. The rebellion was crushed. The traitors were dealt with. The kingdom was theirs to shape. But as they looked out over the slowly healing hall, they both knew the most important work was just beginning. The work of building a future worthy of the sacrifices they had made. Chapter 23, The King's Heart. The gardens were quiet. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the only sound was the gentle whisper of the wind through the rose bushes and the soft chirping of crickets. The moon, full and bright, bathed the stone pathways in a wash of pure silver light. It was the first night of peace, the first night of their new life. Celine walked through the gardens, her hand resting on the smooth, cool bark of a willow tree, its branches a familiar, weeping shape under the moonlight. She felt a deep, quiet contentment settle in her soul, a feeling so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. The restless, anxious energy that had been her constant companion for years was gone. The hollow ache of worthlessness had been filled. She heard his footsteps behind her, steady and sure on the gravel path. He didn't startle her. She had felt his approach through the bond, a familiar, welcome warmth. Darius came to stand beside her, his presence a solid, comforting wall of strength. He was no longer the cold, broken king she had first met. The harsh lines of pain around his eyes had softened. The restless, savage energy was gone, replaced by a deep, powerful calm that mirrored her own. He was whole. He was hers. I haven't slept so peacefully in a decade, he said, his voice a low, soft rumble in the quiet night. Not until your scent filled my rooms, my bed, my life. He turned to her, his silver eyes luminous in the moonlight, filled with an emotion so raw, so vulnerable it stole her breath. I was a king of shadows, Celine, he confessed, his hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. Haunted by a past I couldn't escape, ruling a kingdom I felt nothing for. It was all just power, a way to keep the beast at bay. He shook his head, a look of wonder on his face. Then you came, this quiet, fragile Omega who faced down my beast with a fire I had never seen. You didn't just save my life, you gave it back to me. He pulled her gently into his arms, burying his face in her hair, inhaling her scent as if it were air itself. You are not just my mate or my anchor or even my queen, he whispered against her skin. You are the soul of this kingdom, you are its heart, and you are mine. Tears of pure, unadulterated joy welled in her eyes. She leaned back, her hands framing his handsome face. And you, Darius Blackthorn, are mine. She kissed him, a slow, tender kiss filled with all the unspoken promises of their future. It was a kiss of peace, of homecoming, of a love that had been forged in fire and betrayal and had emerged stronger than steel. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms under the watchful eye of the moon. The journey had been a brutal one, a trial that had nearly cost them everything, but it had led them here, to this perfect, quiet moment of peace. Celine leaned her head against his steady chest, her hand drifting down to rest protectively on her own flat stomach. A new secret, a new joy, a new life was beginning to blossom within her. A child, the Alpha King's heir, a symbol of their love and the future of their peaceful kingdom. They called her a helpless Omega. They called her cursed. But as she stood there, the mate of a healed king, the savior of a kingdom, and the mother of its future, she knew the truth. She was never helpless. She was just waiting for the king who saw her as his equal. Thank you so much for watching this video. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. If you enjoyed what you saw, we've got a whole library of other videos packed with more great content just like this waiting for you on our channel. So, why not dive into another one right now? And hey, if you want to make sure you don't miss out on our next upload, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We'd love to have you join our community and see you in the next video. Thanks again.